The freezing rain stung my face as the funeral ended. A stranger handed me a court order, DNA proof I wasn't a Sterling. My brother's guards slammed me into the mud, but I grabbed his phone before they could stop me. Now I'm running, my name erased, my family stolen, and the only clue is in my ex-fiancé's betrayal. The gates won't open. The jewelry is gone, and Julian's smile was the last thing I saw before the world turned against me. I have one encrypted phone and a name I can't trust. If I don't crack this in time, I lose everything. My past, my future, my identity. The rain keeps falling. The clock is ticking, and my own blood wants me dead. The scent of lilies cloyed against the damp wool of Claire's coat, mixing with the metallic tang of wet earth. Rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the sea of black umbrellas, a hollow percussion that drowned out the priest's rhythmic drone. Silence usually reigned in the Sterling family plot. But today, the mud sucked at Claire's heels, anchoring her to the ground, while her father's mahogany casket hovered over the open trench. A man in a tan windbreaker crested the hill, his sneakers splashing through the puddles. He didn't belong to the mourners. He lacked their rigid posture and rehearsed grief. He bypassed the weeping aunts and the stone-faced board members, steering directly toward Claire. "Claire Sterling?" he asked. His voice cracked, thin and reedy against the wind. Claire tightened her grip on the silver handle of her umbrella. "Not now." The man reached into his jacket, pulling out a sodden envelope. "You've been served." He thrust the paper forward. It brushed against her lace veil before she caught it. The weight of the document seemed heavier than the casket. Across the grave, her stepmother's eyes narrowed, the grief in them sharpening into a cold, calculated edge. Claire didn't open the envelope. She didn't have to. The blue ink of the court seal bled into the white paper, blurring the words until they resembled a bruise. "Is there a problem, Claire?" Her stepmother whispered, her hand resting on the polished wood of the coffin. The priest stopped mid-sentence. The only sound remaining was the hiss of rain and the heavy thud of the server's footsteps as he retreated into the gray mist. Claire shoved the damp packet into her pocket, the paper crinkling like dry bone. She stared at the hole in the earth, realizing the funeral hadn't even finished before the scavenging began. She reached into her other pocket, her fingers finding the smooth, cool surface of the river stone. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythmic strike against her thigh was the only thing keeping her lungs from collapsing. She looked at the document again. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was an erasure. The words "biological invalidation" leapt off the page. The court order claimed that a DNA profile, recently submitted to the estate's executors, proved she was not James Sterling's daughter. In the eyes of the law, she was a ghost, haunting a house she no longer owned. The burial ended not with a prayer, but with the mechanical whine of the lowering straps. Claire didn't stay for the reception. She didn't stay to hear the false condolences of people who were already calculating how much the Sterling art collection would fetch at auction. She turned toward the iron gates of the cemetery, her mind racing through a checklist of survival. If the DNA was invalid, the locks would be the first thing to change. She drove toward the Sterling mansion in Greenwich, the wipers on her car fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The neighborhood was a fortress of false comfort, where the manicured lawns looked like they were trimmed with nail scissors. As she turned onto the private drive, the massive wrought iron gates loomed out of the fog. She reached for the remote on her visor and pressed it. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder, until her thumb hurt. The red light on the remote blinked, but the gates remained as still as gravestones. Claire stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking through her black dress. She ran to the keypad mounted on the stone pillar and swiped her keycard. The sensor, usually a welcoming green, flashed a harsh, angry red. The system refused to recognize her, like a locked door presented with the wrong key. "It won't work, Claire." The voice came from the other side of the bars. Julian stood there, shielded by a massive black umbrella held by a man in a dark suit. Julian looked perfect, his white silk shirt pristine despite the humidity, his tie knotted with surgical precision. He looked like the master of the house because, as of 3 hours ago, he was. "Open the gate, Julian," Claire said, her voice low and dangerous. "I'm getting my mother's jewelry. I'm not leaving it in this house with you." Julian stepped closer to the bars, a thin smile playing on his lips. "The Sterling jewelry belongs to the Sterling estate. And since you are officially a Jane Doe with a penchant for trespassing, I suggest you turn around. I grew up here. You can't just flip a switch and pretend I don't exist." Claire lunged for the bars, her fingers catching the cold metal. Behind Julian, 2 more security guards stepped out of the shadows of the gatehouse. They didn't move like mall cops. They moved like soldiers. Julian adjusted his cufflink, a gesture of bored dominance. "Escort the intruder off the premises. Use whatever force the situation dictates." The gates groaned open just enough for the men to slip through. Claire didn't back down. She had spent a decade building walls, and she wasn't about to let Julian kick them over. As the first guard reached for her arm, she spun, using the weight of her heavy handbag to strike him across the jaw. The sound was a dull thud, like a hammer hitting a side of beef. But there were too many of them. The second guard lunged, his fingers digging into her shoulders. He spun her around and shoved. Claire's feet skidded on the wet pavement, and she went down hard. The impact vibrated through her teeth as her shoulder hit the mud. Cold, slick earth filled her mouth and ruined the lace of her funeral dress. "Stay down," the guard growled, his boot inches from her face. Julian watched from the safety of the dry pavement, his eyes tracking a microscopic speck of mud that had splashed onto his shoe. He looked disgusted, not by the violence, but by the messiness of it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, a sleek, encrypted device that held the blueprints of his new empire. He began to type, likely ordering a cleaning crew to scrub the driveway of her presence. Claire saw her opening. As the guard turned to look at Julian for further instructions, she lunged from the mud. She didn't go for the guard's throat. She went for Julian. She scrambled up, a blur of black silk and brown silt, and crashed into the bars. Julian flinched, dropping the phone. It skittered across the wet stone, sliding through the gap in the gate. Claire's hand shot out, her fingers clawing at the ground. She felt the cold glass and metal of the device. She snatched it, tucking it into the waistband of her dress just as the guards swarmed over her. A heavy hand slammed into her back, pinning her into the muck. Her cheek pressed against the grit of the driveway. "Get her out of here," Julian hissed, his voice finally losing its calm. "Now." The guards dragged her by the arms, her heels carving twin furrows in the mud. They tossed her toward her car like a bag of refuse. Claire lay there for a moment, the rain washing the blood from a cut on her forehead. Her body screamed in pain, but her hand pressed against the hard rectangle hidden against her skin. She had his phone. She had the keys to his kingdom. She managed to crawl into the driver's seat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't look back at the mansion. She drove. She drove until the gates were a memory in the rearview mirror, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a neon-lit diner on the edge of town. The smell of grease and burnt coffee was a welcome change from the cloying lilies. Inside a corner booth, a man sat with a mountain of crumpled napkins and a cold cup of joe. Bobby Miller looked like he had been born in a trench coat and hadn't slept since the 90s. He didn't look up when Claire slid into the booth, dripping water onto the vinyl seat. "You look like hell, kid," Bobby said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I have the phone," Claire whispered, her fingers trembling as she pulled the device from her waist. "And I have a headache that feels like a freight train." Bobby took the phone, turning it over in his calloused hands. "Julian's personal line. Nice. I've been busy too. While you were playing in the mud, I was tracking the signature on that DNA report you showed me." Claire leaned forward, ignoring the way her wet clothes clung to her skin. "And? The lab tech who signed off on the invalid results? A guy named Matthew Scott. Ring a bell?" The name hit Claire like a physical blow. Matthew, her ex-fiancé. The man who had sat at her father's dinner table for 3 years. The man who had promised to build a life with her before disappearing 6 months ago without a word. "He was on Julian's payroll the whole time," Bobby said, his tongue clicking against his teeth. "This wasn't just a legal move. It was a long con. Matthew didn't just leave you, he stayed close enough to bury you." Claire felt the familiar rhythm in her leg. Tap, 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 tap. She needed to see him. She needed to look into Matthew's eyes and see the moment he sold her soul for a sterling paycheck. "I found where he's staying," Bobby continued, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "He's at a private clinic in the city. Julian's keeping him on a short leash. If we move now, we catch him before he can vanish again. This is the win, Claire. We get Matthew to admit the test was faked, and the court order turns into confetti." Claire felt a surge of hope. It was logical. Matthew was the weak link. He was a coward who spoke in questions. He wouldn't hold up under pressure. If they could get a recorded confession, the nightmare would end before the sun went down. "Let's go," Claire said, her voice regaining its clinical edge. Subverted. They drove into Manhattan, the city lights a blur of neon and rain. Bobby's car smelled of stale cigarettes, but Claire didn't mind. She was focused on the plan. It was a smart move. Matthew Scott was a perfectionist who cracked when things got messy. She knew his patterns, his fears, his apologies. By confronting him directly, she wasn't just seeking evidence. She was reclaiming her narrative. Bobby had the recording equipment ready. They would corner him in his office at the clinic, present the evidence of Julian's embezzlement she'd found on the phone, and offer him a deal. Immunity for the truth. It was a calculated, strategic strike. They reached the clinic, a sleek glass building that looked more like a tech firm than a medical facility. Bobby used a bypass tool to get them through the service entrance. They moved through the darkened hallways, the scent of peppermint oil and floor wax thick in the air. "Room 402, Bobby whispered. Claire pushed the door open. Matthew was there, sitting behind a desk piled high with folders. He looked up, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Claire? What are you doing here?" "The game is over, Matthew," Claire said, stepping into the light. She laid Julian's phone on the desk. "I know about the payments. I know the DNA report is a fabrication. If you sign a sworn statement right now, I can protect you from the fraud charges Julian is going to face." Matthew looked at the phone, then at Claire. He began to tremble. I didn't have a choice. He said he would ruin my career." He reached for a pen, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I'll sign whatever you want. I have the original records right here in the cabinet." Claire felt a wave of relief wash through her. Her shoulders dropped, and for the first time in 48 hours, she took a full breath. It was working. The smart play had paid off. Bobby moved toward the filing cabinet, his hand already reaching for the folders. "See, kid, easy as counting cards." But as Matthew reached for the paper, Claire noticed something. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the digital clock on the wall. It was 11:11, a specific, synchronized time, and he wasn't crying anymore. The trembling in his hands had stopped instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. "Matthew?" Claire asked, her unease prickling like a cold draft. Matthew didn't answer. He didn't use his uptalk voice. He looked directly at the security camera in the corner of the room and nodded. The door behind them didn't just close. It locked with a heavy, motorized thud that vibrated through the floor. A red light began to pulse in the ceiling. "I'm sorry, Claire," Matthew said, his voice now flat and devoid of emotion. "But Julian said you'd come here. He said you'd think this was the logical move." The computer screen on the desk flared to life. It wasn't showing DNA records. It was showing a live feed of the hallway they had just walked through. 2 police officers were standing outside the door, but they weren't there to help. They were holding a warrant. "You broke into a high-security medical facility," Matthew said, standing up and smoothing his lab coat. "You stole a private encrypted device from Mr. Sterling, and now you've been caught on camera attempting to bribe a forensic witness to falsify legal documents." Claire lunged for the phone on the desk, but Matthew was faster. He swept it into a drawer, which locked with an electronic click. "The DNA report isn't faked, Claire," Matthew whispered, leaning over the desk. "It's been verified by 3 other labs now. Because Julian didn't just pay me to lie. He paid me to make sure the lie became the truth. Every sample in the city system now says you aren't a Sterling. You didn't find the evidence. You walked into a trap designed to make you a felon." The sirens began to wail outside, the sound bouncing off the glass walls. Claire looked at Bobby, but the investigator was already looking at the door, his face pale. They weren't just losing the inheritance. They were about to lose their freedom. Julian hadn't just predicted her move. He had built a stage for her to fail on. "Go," Bobby hissed, grabbing Claire's arm. "The ventilation shaft in the back. You said you knew the blueprints." They scrambled toward the wall, Claire's mind spinning. She had thought she was the hunter, but Julian had been the one holding the leash the entire time. Every step she took to prove her identity was being used to build a cage around her. They squeezed into the narrow, metallic dark of the air ducts, just as the door to the office was kicked open. The sound of shouting and heavy boots echoed through the vents, a rhythmic drumming that mimicked the rain on her father's casket. Claire crawled, the cold metal biting into her palms, her heart hammering against her ribs. They emerged an hour later in a trash-strewn alley 3 blocks away. Claire's dress was shredded, her skin covered in a layer of gray dust and grease. Bobby leaned against a brick wall, coughing. "My license," he wheezed, checking his phone. "It's gone. Revoked. Unethical conduct. He's stripping us down to the bone, Claire." "He hasn't won yet," Claire said, though her voice lacked conviction. She reached into her pocket and felt the stone. Tap, 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 tap. "We need to go to the safe house. We need to go dark." The safe house was a cramped apartment in Queens, a place that smelled of old wallpaper and desperation. The radiator knocked with a metallic rhythm that kept Claire on edge. She sat by the boarded-up window, watching the street through a sliver of wood. A black SUV sat at the end of the block. It hadn't moved in 3 hours. "They know we're here," Bobby said, pacing the small room. He was clutching a yellowed grocery list, his fingers tracing the faded ink of milk, eggs, flour. "They can't," Claire argued. "We switched cars. We didn't use any cards." "Julian doesn't need cards. He has eyes everywhere." The silence of the apartment was shattered by a soft, melodic sound. It wasn't a siren or a shout. It was humming, a low, haunting funeral dirge that seemed to be coming from the hallway. "Nearer, my God, to thee." Claire froze. The sound was thin, passing through the wood of the door like a ghost. Then came the smell, the faint, metallic tang of scorched dust. A laser cutter. "Bobby, get down!" Claire screamed. The door didn't burst open. It was carved. A perfect circle of wood fell inward, and a flashbang grenade rolled across the floor. The world turned into a searing white light and a sound that felt like her skull was splitting open. Claire scrambled backward, her hands finding a heavy cast-iron skillet on the kitchenette counter. She couldn't see, her vision swimming with purple blotches, but she knew the layout. 6 steps to the left, 3 steps back. She felt the edge of the refrigerator. A figure stepped through the hole in the door. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace, a suppressed pistol held steady. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a shadow. Claire didn't wait for him to find her. She used the architectural knowledge of the space. The way the floorboards creaked near the door, the way the ceiling dipped. She climbed onto the counter, her fingers catching the edge of the upper cabinets. As the hitman moved toward the bedroom where Bobby lay dazed, Claire dropped. She didn't land on him. She swung the skillet with every ounce of rage she had left. The metal connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening clack. He crumpled, his pistol skittering across the linoleum. Bobby lunged from the floor, pinning the man's arms. "I got him! I got him!" Claire stood over them, her breath hitching. She reached into the hitman's pocket and pulled out a burner phone. It was vibrating. A text message sat on the screen. "Litigation complete. Liquidate the assets." "It's not just about the name," Claire whispered, her eyes scanning the messages. "Look at this, Bobby. Julian is selling the Sterling real estate holdings, all of them. The downtown towers, the logistics hubs, the foundations. He's gutting the company." Bobby looked at the screen. Why would he destroy the thing he's trying to steal? Because he's already destroyed it, Claire realized. The embezzlement. He didn't just take a few million. He emptied the reserves. Dad must have found out. That's why he died so suddenly. And that's why I have to be erased. If I'm a Sterling, I have the right to call for a full audit. If I'm a stranger, I have no standing to look at the books. The hitman groaned, and Bobby silenced him with a sharp jab to the ribs. "We have to move. The cremation is at dawn. If your father's body's gone, we lose the only untainted DNA in the state." They abandoned the safe house, leaving the hitman tied to the radiator. The drive to the cemetery was a blur of speed and terror. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple light that signaled the end of their time. They reached the Sterling mausoleum just as the first rays of light hit the marble angels. The heavy bronze doors were ajar. The lock snapped. Claire ran inside, the smell of damp stone and cold air rushing to meet her. The center pedestal was empty. The mahogany casket, the one she had watched descend into the earth only yesterday, was gone. "We're too late," Bobby whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow chamber. Claire fell to her knees, her hands touching the cold stone where the casket should have been. She felt the weight of the loss, the finality of it. Julian had won. He had burned the evidence, smeared her name, and stolen her life. "No," Claire said, her voice cracking. "There's one more thing. The locket." "What locket?" My father gave me a gold locket when I was 10. It has a lock of my mother's hair inside. Real, biological hair. It's in the family vault in Manhattan, the high-security one. Julian wouldn't have cleared it out yet. It's too small, too personal. He's focused on the big assets. Claire, that vault is a fortress, Bobby said. If we go there, we're walking into the heart of his territory. It's the only way, she said, her fingers finding the stone in her pocket. Tap, 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 tap. It's the only piece of the truth left. The Manhattan Vault facility was a windowless cube of reinforced concrete and steel. The air inside was recycled and thin, smelling of ozone and scorched dust. Claire and Bobby moved through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by the heavy industrial carpeting. The Sterling box is in the sub-basement, Claire whispered. Level 4. They bypassed the first 2 security gates using a cloned keycard Bobby had kept from his days on the force. But as they reached the final corridor, the lights flickered and died. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Well-timed, Claire, a voice echoed through the darkness. A single spotlight snapped on at the end of the hall. Julian sat in a leather chair, his legs crossed, his white shirt glowing in the artificial light. Behind him stood 4 armed guards, their faces hidden by shadows. You really are a creature of habit, Julian said, standing up. The locket, the sentimental scrap of a dead woman. Did you really think I'd leave the one thing that could ruin me sitting in a box? He held up a small gold heart. It glinted in the light. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he dropped it onto the floor and ground his heel into it. The sound of crushing metal was like a gunshot in the small space. It's gone, Claire. Just like your name. Just like your father. Subverted. Claire felt the world tilt. This was the moment she had prepared for. She had a backup plan, a hidden camera in her button, a digital recorder in Bobby's belt. She needed Julian to confess, to boast, to provide the verbal evidence that would satisfy a judge. She stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. You've won, Julian, she said, her voice trembling with a carefully crafted vulnerability. Just tell me why. Tell me why you had to kill him. Tell me how you faked the records. Give me that much, and I'll sign the NDA. I'll disappear. It was a classic walls-down play. She was inviting him to gloat, to fill the silence with his ego. Julian loved the sound of his own architectural metaphors. He wouldn't be able to resist explaining his masterpiece. Bobby was recording everything, the signal beaming to a remote server. Julian smiled, that warm, fatherly smile that never reached his eyes. You want the blueprint? Fine. It was easy, Claire. Our father was a man of rules, but rules are just lines on a page. I redirected the cash flow, built a new foundation under his feet, and when he finally looked down and saw the rot, his heart simply gave out. With a little help from his medication, of course. Claire felt a surge of triumph. He'd said it. He'd admitted to the embezzlement and hinted at the murder. She looked at Bobby, expecting a nod of confirmation. But Bobby wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his phone. The screen was black. Oh, Claire, Julian sighed, stepping closer. Did you think I didn't know about the Sunday rewrite? Did you think I didn't know Bobby Miller has been in debt to my shell companies for 5 years? Bobby stepped away from Claire, his head hanging low. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the yellowed grocery list, ripping it into tiny pieces. I'm sorry, kid. They were going to take my house. They were going to erase her memory. Bobby, Claire whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical blow. He didn't record a thing, Julian said. his voice oily. "In fact, the only thing being recorded right now is your confession to the breaking and entering of this vault. And as for the legal system..." Julian pulled a document from his jacket. It was a signed affidavit from Judge Richard Wagner, the man Claire had hoped would hear her appeal. "The judge is on my board of directors now, Claire. He's already signed the order for your commitment. You aren't going to jail. You're going to a private sanitarium, a place where mentally unstable girls who think they're heiresses go to be quiet." The guards moved in. Claire tried to fight, but the weight of the betrayal had made her limbs heavy. They pinned her arms, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Julian leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive mints and cold ambition. "The sun is up, Claire. The cremation is finished. You are officially nobody." The world went black as a hood was pulled over her head. She woke up in the back of a moving van, the vibration of the road rattling her teeth. Her hands were bound with heavy plastic zip ties. She was alone in the dark, the smell of exhaust fumes filling the small space. But Julian had made one mistake. He had treated her like a sterling, a pampered girl who broke when her toys were taken. He forgot that she was an architect. She knew how things were built, and she knew how they could be unmade. Hidden in the lining of her sleeve was a sharpened drafting tool, a small, needle-like steel pick she used for fine-scale models. She had kept it there for years, a habit of her walls-up mentality. She didn't panic. She breathed, counting to 4. Tap, 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 tap. She maneuvered the tool into the locking mechanism of the zip ties. It took 3 minutes of agonizing focus, her fingers numbing. But finally, the plastic gave way with a soft click. She didn't wait for the van to stop. She moved to the back doors, finding the manual release lever hidden behind the interior paneling. She waited for the van to slow for a turn, then threw the doors open and rolled into the tall grass of a highway embankment. She didn't go back for the locket. She didn't go back for the DNA. She realized she had been fighting on Julian's terms, looking for a past that he had already burned. She needed to target his future. That night, the Sterling Gala was in full swing at the Metropolitan Museum. The air was thick with the scent of Dior and lilies. Julian stood on a raised dais, a champagne flute in his hand, his white shirt glowing under the crystal chandeliers. He was giving a toast to legacy. Claire didn't enter through the front door. She used the service tunnels, the blueprints of the museum etched into her mind. She emerged from behind a velvet curtain just as Julian reached the climax of his speech. "To the future of the Sterling name," he cried. "The name isn't yours, Julian." The room went silent. Claire walked down the center aisle, her dress torn, her face bruised, but her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. The guests, wearing their custom silk masks, turned like a school of fish. Julian laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Someone call security. The stalker has returned." But Claire wasn't looking for a microphone. She lunged. She didn't use a gun. She used the drafting tool. As the guards rushed forward, she slashed the point across Julian's outstretched hand. Blood, bright red, biological blood, sprayed across his white silk shirt. The perfect numbered shirt was ruined. Julian shrieked, clutching his hand, the red stain spreading like a blooming flower. "There's your sample," Claire shouted. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward. Jennifer Lopez, the forensic technician Bobby had actually flipped hours before his betrayal in the vault. Bobby hadn't sold Claire out. He had played the long con on Julian, making him believe the trap had worked so he would show up at the gala. Jennifer pressed a sterile swab to the blood on the floor. Outside, the subterranean rumble of the subway was replaced by the wail of federal sirens. "The mystery is solved, Julian," Claire said, her voice echoing in the vaulted hall. "We didn't need my DNA. We needed yours. Because I found the one thing you couldn't erase. The adoption records from the state home in 1992. You aren't a Sterling. You were the one who was adopted. Our father found out, and that's why you killed him." Julian looked down at his shirt, his eyes wide with a primal animal terror. The white silk was a mess. The order was gone. The chaos had arrived. As the federal agents swarmed the stage, Claire didn't stay to watch the arrest. She walked out of the museum into the cool night air of Manhattan. Weeks later, Claire sat in her father's empty office. The mahogany desk was bare, the rules of engagement removed from the walls. She had sold the mansion, the towers, the art. She had kept enough to build something new, a foundation for children who had been erased by the system. She went to the cemetery one last time. The sun was shining, the grass green and vibrant. She stood before the Sterling plot, but she didn't feel the weight of the name anymore. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the river stone. She looked at it for a long moment, then knelt and placed it on the fresh earth of her father's grave. She didn't need to count to 4 anymore. She was one person, whole and real, and for the first time in her life, the walls were down. Claire Sterling turned and walked away, her footsteps light on the path, leaving the ghosts behind in the silence. The end.